Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Professor Andrew Bacevich. Professor Bacevich is a historian specializing in international relations, security studies, American foreign policies, and American diplomatic and military history. He's a professor emeritus of international relations and military history at Boston University. He's a retired career officer from the US Army, having served in the Vietnam War and the First Gulf War. And he has written many books, several books. Today, we will speak about his latest book, After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed. Professor Bacevich, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my privilege. Thank you.
May I ask you if I pronounce your name correctly?
Bacevich, that's right. Bacevich, like baseball.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So, wow, you have a very interesting background. You have served in the armed force and you have been teaching all this American foreign policy. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your background, how, for example, you got interested in joining the Army.
So I was, I grew up in the Midwest, right outside of Chicago. My dad was a doctor. My mom was a homemaker. Both of them were veterans of World War II. And I think that their military service had a deep influence on me. You know, growing up in the United States in the 1950s, it was a patriotic time. In part, I think, because of the overhang of World War II, in part because of the ongoing Cold War. That very much defined the environment that I grew up in. And so for that reason and other reasons, when I graduated from high school in 1965, I was presented with the opportunity to go to West Point and took it. And after 4 years of West Point, I owed the United States government 5 years of military service. And so I was commissioned in the Army, and that was in the latter stages of Vietnam. So one of the first things I did was to go to Vietnam. My wife and I got married in 1970. We subsequently had 4 children. It took me a long time to have the confidence to get out of the Army to see if I could make a living on the outside. So we ended up staying in the service for 23 years. During that period of time, I was very fortunate that the Army sent me to graduate school. And at graduate school, I became a student of US history, as you mentioned. When I eventually got out of the Army, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I was attracted to academic life. And through the grace of God and the kindness of strangers, I ended up becoming a professor at Boston University for 16 years. Being at BU gave me a time to write. So I began to write books and articles and found that I really enjoyed that. When I retired from BU, since retiring from BU, which is a half dozen years ago now, I've mostly focused on my writing life, although about 3 years ago, I was one of the co-founders of a new Washington think tank called the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. The purpose of the Quincy Institute, our namesake is John Quincy Adams, by the way. The purpose of the Quincy Institute is to promote the principle of restraint as a cornerstone of US foreign policy. What that means is reducing our reliance, our use of military force, and trying to re-emphasize diplomacy. We are not pacifists, we are not isolationists. We are absolutely committed to having the United States engaged with the world. But we think that there are better ways to engage than to be invading countries and bombing them and otherwise throwing our weight around militarily. So we're trying to bring about a fundamental change in thinking about America's role in the world. that's kind of
Wow.
how I got to where I am today.
As a person who is not from the United States, I see the double image that the United States have. In one side is the place that represents freedom and wealth. On the other side, many people outside of the United States see it as this imperialistic country that doesn't hesitate to drop bombs on anyone. And so it's this love-hate relationship that we have with your country. It has so many things to admire, but at the same time, we are fearful, especially with the last president. Even at the last moment, we didn't know if he was going to hit the nuclear button just to stay in charge for a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm. Well, your background and upbringing is different than mine, but I think I understand what you just said. My father's father, my father's parents, came from Lithuania, and my grandfather, who I never met because he passed away before I was born, he was a working class guy. I don't exactly know why they left Lithuania, but certainly, reflecting what you just said, they came to the United States because they believed that this was a place that was going to give them a better life. I'm sure a better life in terms of economic opportunity, but I suspect a better life in terms of freedom as well. And my father, coming out of this working class background, after the war, was able to go to college, was able to go to medical school, became a physician, and basically moved our family into the comfortable middle class. In other words, that expectation of the opportunity that many people believe America can bring, I lived that. I mean, I don't claim any credit for it, but I'm a beneficiary. Now, right now, we've got, as I speak to you, we've got a couple guys in the basement who are finishing the basement in our house. As a three-man crew, and they're all Brazilians. Two of them clearly do not speak any English. The boss does. They're down there. They're working hard. They're doing good work. And they remind me that vision of America as a land of promise is still alive for a lot of people. And yet, as you suggested, there is this pattern of behavior. You use the term imperialism. Very few Americans will acknowledge an imperialist tradition, but there is an imperialist tradition. Probably Latin Americans understand it more than anybody. So there is a split image, I think. As I've gotten older, I have come to a greater appreciation of the dark side of American behavior. And in many respects, my book, After the Apocalypse, is a reflection on how the events of 2020 brought to the forefront that dark side, kind of rubbed our face in it and made it very difficult for us to ignore the problems that seem to all come together in the year 2020.
Can you summarize your book, After the Apocalypse?
Well, it is a very short book. It's only about 170 pages long. So if anybody who's listening to this, you can probably read it in about 2.5 hours. I think the summary would be this. The apocalypse referred to in the title are all the terrible events of 2020. The climate crisis, the pandemic, the economic collapse stemming from the pandemic, the incompetence and recklessness of the Trump administration, the eruption of demands for a reckoning with American racism, which then produced a backlash by white populists who don't want to see any such reckoning happen. So bottom line is 2020 was a bad year, terrible year. Mm. Here, you and I are speaking in 2021. Not for a second do I think that we somehow put that behind us. In a sense, it's a continuing crisis. But the point of the book was to try to understand some of the implications of that crisis, in particular, some of the implications of how the United States should define its role in the world. That's what it really tries to do. And I should emphasize, I think, all kinds of people are going to spend all kinds of time and effort over the next quarter of a century trying to come to terms with what the United States has just experienced. That catalog of catastrophes that I just listed.
You come from a military family. You yourself, you spent over 20 years in the military, and I cannot imagine how you must have felt, or your colleagues, when the previous president was disrespecting military families. I just cannot imagine. I don't know whether it's shame, pain, or embarrassment. Can you tell me what you felt when you?
Honestly, it didn't bother me, not much. And what I mean by that is that I had come to view President Trump as such a buffoon that I didn't take anything that he said very seriously. He is not a serious human being. It's like I used to compare him to a young kid, young 5-year-old boy who sort of blurts out embarrassing things. And when it's a 5-year-old boy, we sort of say, well, that's what little kids do. Here we had a guy who was in his 70s who was blurting out absurd things. But I didn't take the man seriously. I'm glad that we have managed to survive his presidency. There are those who think that Trump did unprecedented damage to our republic. I actually disagree. I think he became president because our republic had sustained so much damage. I agree with you. He was a symptom of a problem set, not the cause of the problem set. And the reason I think that's an important thing to reflect on is, yes, he's gone. He's gone. He's out of office anyway. He's not gone. He's out of office, but the problem set persists. And our penchant for war is an example of that that problem set. So too, and this is one of the things I write about in the book, so too is this whole notion of American exceptionalism, whereby we have come to believe that history, history with a capital H, that history has chosen us to be its instrument, that somehow or other we define history's purposes. Somehow or other, everybody from Canadians to Colombians to, you name it, are all somehow destined to embrace the American way of life as the universally approved way of life. That expectation is wrong and it's dangerous, but I think it's still with us.
One of the ironies that I see from the outside is that, one of the hallmarks of American life, it's freedom. Now, after September 11, when about 3,000 people died, a lot of Americans were willing to give up some of their freedoms in order to fight the terrorists or whatever evil forces that were attacking America. But now we have over 600,000 people dead, and we are unwilling to put a mask because that is inflicting our freedoms.
Uh, it's inexplicable. I mean, to some degree, I would speculate it's an expression of the enormous dysfunction in American politics, a dysfunction that has made it almost impossible for us to define the common good. The common good, a set of values and aspirations to which citizens subscribe, and that then define an agenda of governance for leaders. You know, in my country, we have two parties: it's the Republicans and the Democrats. I would never want to imply that in some good old days that Republicans and Democrats all got along. If you know, they're opposition parties, but at root, at some level, I do think that there was a generalized notion of the common good to which all subscribed, and that provided a sort of basis for continuity in U.S. policy. And now I think that's gone away. I mean, the problem is most evident in the Republican Party, which, in my judgment, has actually ceased to be a party. There are no principles that you can identify that you would say, aha, this is what the Republicans stand for. There's none, except maybe deference to former President Trump, but no set of serious principles. The Democrats, it's probably easier to identify a set of principles that they articulate, but that's different from a set of principles that they adhere to. You know, I certainly am one of those who believes that the climate crisis is the thing we need to worry about most today, not 20 years from now, today. And President Biden's administration says that it agrees with that, and yet President Biden's administration is approving additional licenses to explore for gas and oil in the United States. How can that be helpful? So one can approve of some of the things that the Democrats say, but they don't necessarily act in accordance with what they profess. The American political system is pretty close to broken at this point.
Wow. Are there any bright spots?
You know, I'm 74. I'm not sure I'm the right person to. I mean, younger people are better able at looking at bright spots. Well, I mean, there is a growing a grassroots awareness of the problems we have. I think there's a grassroots awareness that the militarization of U.S. policy leading, for example, to these endless wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, I think there's a growing realization that that was all a mistake. You know, there needs to be a better approach to statecraft. I think that there's a growing realization that social media is dangerous, corrupting. I mean, that doesn't, I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on, you know, Twitter, I'm not on any of that kind of stuff. I don't, but I do think it's beginning to sink in that social media destroys the concept of privacy, poisons public discourse, doesn't encourage understanding. It sows hatred and contempt. That hasn't advanced to the point that anybody's going to do anything about it, but I think there's a growing awareness. So I guess I'm enough of a believer in democracy that I continue to believe that somehow we can recover our bearings. I just can't see how that's going to happen. I cannot identify the political leader or leaders who's going to emerge. But as I said to somebody the other day, in 1855, who would have said, oh, Abraham Lincoln, he's going to be the salvation of the republic? He kind of came out of nowhere. Really only even when he was elected, expectations, I think, were fairly low about what he would accomplish. And then in office, he grew to meet the moment. I don't know who our Abraham Lincoln's going to be,
Wow.
but we probably need comparable leadership.
Do you have the sense that American warfare is becoming more like a video game? I mean, before you had soldiers at the time that your parents were in World War II, they had to go into the field and face each other. Now someone with a laptop can just hit a button and send a drone and kill someone, and it's all based on statistics. Okay, chances are that we may hit the right persons, chances are that or a small percentage that we may not, but we are so isolated from the real horror of the war that it almost doesn't seem, and most Americans just see it on TV. They don't have a direct you lost your son on war, but most Americans are so isolated from this, they think it's just like a video game.
Yeah, so two things. The first is, you're right. So we are a country that is more frequently at war than anybody else on the planet, and maybe with the exception of Israel, but basically anybody else on the planet. And yet the American people, because we rely on the so-called all-volunteer force, the American people sit in the sidelines and cheer, but have no skin in the game, to use that phrase. And that encourages a lack of understanding about the true nature of war. Now, that said, while it is true, you gave a description of sort of push-button war and drones and, people sitting in a metal container in Nevada that are conducting an attack in Afghanistan by pushing a button. That emergence of that kind of high-tech war is true, but the old war survives. And the old-fashioned war, the war that is American soldiers walking through a village in Iraq and being ambushed, or riding in a convoy in Afghanistan and hitting an IED that blows up the vehicle. That's war that is not a heck of a lot different than was the war in Vietnam or World War II or World War I. It's just that the average American citizen has become oblivious to that. So, the number of Americans killed in Iraq and Afghanistan is fairly small in comparison, let's say, with Vietnam. The number of Americans wounded is large. The number of American soldiers who bear the scars of war, PTSD, for example, traumatic brain injuries, for example, that number is very large. There is a growing awareness that we have a suicide problem with our former soldiers, our veterans who served in these recent wars. And the point is that war continues to damage the human beings who participate in them, even when those human beings don't suffer physical wounds. So I end up being in the camp that says, no, I don't think the nature of war actually has changed. And it's important to recognize that, because that helps you appreciate how serious it is to make a decision that we're going to go to war, wherever. And that there was not a serious understanding of war. Back in 2001, when George W. Bush sent U.S. forces into Afghanistan, and then 2003, when he sent them into Iraq, not just U.S. forces, because Canadian forces participated in much of that too.
about the new war front, which is cyber terrorism. I mean, the Russians, if they were the Russians, interrupted a pipeline in the United
Yeah,
States, and that's just an example of the
yeah,
power. I mean, it could be a
right.
power supply, or I don't know, it could be anything.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to pretend to be an expert in all that, although it's clear that cyber warfare is emerging as the new front. Uh, I guess I would simply say that let's not pretend that it's the Chinese and the Russians who are engaging in cyber warfare, and somehow the Americans are sitting back being innocent. That is not the case. We ourselves use cyber weapons to attack others. The I think that there is a need. Maybe it's impossible, but there is a need to define rules, as it were, about what's tolerable and what's not. To some degree, the action in the cyber world is just simply a new version of espionage. And the kind of stuff that nations have been doing to one another for centuries. Espionage is not going to go away. We engage in espionage. Canada engages in espionage. That's part of the game. The challenge, and I think it's an immense challenge, is to try to limit activity to that kind of sphere, which is about intelligence collection, as opposed to efforts to damage infrastructure. You don't have to be a genius to imagine, to foresee kind of tit for tat attacks, on infrastructure, on electrical grids, on banking systems, on communication systems that could produce catastrophic outcomes. And there needs to be an effort to preclude that from happening. I mean, I'm sure there are efforts to preclude that from happening. I just don't know how serious they are and what the prospects of success are.
I have one more question, and this one is in regards to racial tensions. And you, as a historian, there is the radical race theory, and the story of that is being illegal or made illegal in many states in the United States. The story of the slavery past or the dark past of the United States. And I wonder, what's your opinion about that?
I mean, like teaching critical race theory, as it's called?
Yes, it's becoming illegal for,
to some degree, everybody is overreacting, I think. We have a history of racism in our country. It is dark and it is ugly. It's imperative to acknowledge it, and it's imperative then to try to address it. I think that to some degree, all the arguments that are going on about critical race theory or about the so-called 1619 Project distract us from getting on with it. I believe that the vast majority of Americans will continue to see 1776 as the point of origin of our story. At the moment of independence is when our story begins. That doesn't mean we deny the significance of the importation of slaves that began in 1619. But I think that that's not what the majority of Americans will come to see as the point of origin. So to some degree, my counsel is don't overreact. Don't get too excited here. Let's calm down, take a deep breath. And in taking a deep breath, we have to recognize, the existence of the wrongs, and we have to come to some remedy. I mean, I've been at least casually following the story of the revelations about the mistreatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Mm.
You know, guess what? Canadians have their own sins. It's not that Americans are the only ones who sin. And I think that I'm guessing that's probably very hard for Canadians to absorb. And it's very challenging at this late date to figure out what's an appropriate remedy.
Right.
I think we're doing the same thing, larger scale, controversial. And none of this is easy. It would be nice if all parties could approach these things, you know, with a sense of goodwill, rather than accusations and finger pointing and yeah, but your side did this. And again, I think that relates to the ugliness of American politics at this particular moment. That there are not enough people on both sides willing to, you know, engage in honest discourse.
Well, Professor Bacevich, I think your book makes us reflect about our past and about how to restrain for future welfare. I think your voice is adding to the chorus, because not too many. There are other Americans who are not crazy to go about war, who are in favor of restraint, and your book brings that to the forefront. So I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book, and you told us that you are not in social media, but where could followers find out more about you?
So the book is called After the Apocalypse, subtitle, America's Role in a World Transformed. It's available in bookstores, and of course, it's available on Amazon, because everything is available on Amazon. It's published by a New York publisher called Metropolitan Books. And I'd be very grateful if listeners to your podcast would consider reading it. Even be better if they bought it, but if they would read it, I would be very grateful.
And it's a short read, so it's not a huge time commitment.
Correct.
Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed our conversation.